we're going to get going. I have a huge amount of, I'm assuming everybody can hear, but it says in my corner that there's a microphone issue. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. We're doing something, I'm assuming you can all hear, we're doing something this week that we very, very rarely do. And that is we're having two different webinars, one today and one tomorrow. And the reason we did it that way is because they're pretty much connected to each other. The webinar today is kind of the first time we've done it, and that we not only have credits for managers for this webinar, but also there's continuing education credits for attorneys. So if anybody here is an attorney or a manager would like credit for this, please make sure you email either me or somebody from my office, Chelsea or Jody, at the end of today's webinar. So we'll make sure you get the appropriate certificate or whatever else you need. Today, I'm going to be doing a pretty deep dive into the legislation that's pending in the state of New Jersey, as well as some things that are actually in place in the state of New Jersey in regards to structural inspections, facade inspections, and those type of things. So it's going to be, if I was listening, I'd be pretty bored. Let's put it that way. So I can see you on the screen. I'll see if your eyes close or not. Tomorrow might be a little more interesting, and because today I'm talking primarily about the legislation, what it requires, and actually going to show you exactly the words from the legislation and a couple of examples of what reports look like based on that. I'm also going to touch on what the legislation talks about in regards to reserve studies. And tomorrow I'm going to go a little bit more of a deeper dive in terms of exactly what does it mean in terms of reserve studies, funding, what are the new national standards in regard to reserves. So it's going to be more deep dive on that end than on the legislation, which I'm doing today. One thing I'm happy to tell you is that CAI New Jersey Legislative Action Committee is very, very active in terms of the current legislation from the state of New Jersey, which I'm going to talk about. And today, Ed San George, who I'm sure most of you know, is here as not only an observer to correct me, but also Ed is the co-chair of CAI's Legislative Action Committee. And he's going to give us, in a couple seconds, just an update of specifically where we are legislatively in the state of New Jersey with the legislation I'm going to be talking about. And hopefully, as I'm going through, if Ed has any comments, he should feel free to jump in and make comments about what I'm saying. It's a very, very active group that's involved in New Jersey legislation. On the CAI side, the three main people that are involved on a day-to-day basis with that is myself, Ed, and Dave Ramsey. And I don't know if Dave is here today. If he was here and he was going to speak, that would take up a few hours. But just kidding, Dave, if you're here. So as a matter of fact, next week, well, there's ongoing stuff which maybe Ed will talk about. But so what I'm going to be talking about today is the legislation that's pending and current in the state of New Jersey. And like I said, I'm going to take kind of a deep dive because this is a little bit of my background, but I think most of you guys know me. So I'm going to be talking about the primary pillars of building safety. And I'm focusing today on the periodic structural and facade evaluations. Now, most of the people here think of this topic dealing with structural evaluations, but there's more and more evolution of what we're doing because it's real-time stuff that the facades of buildings are going to become more and more involved in this. And there's actually a number of municipalities in the state of New Jersey, which I'm going to go into detail on, that not only require structural inspections, but also facade inspections. I also said that I'm going to touch on the end a little bit about the statutory, the pending legislation regarding reserve studies and funding, and the connection of all this to maintenance. But like I said, I'll be going into a little more deeper with that tomorrow. But let me first give a little background. And what is a building structure? Very simply, a building structure is what holds up the building. It's made up of the foundation, the columns, the beams, and but it's essentially what holds up the building. Now, the next slide, the reason I'm saying what is a building's primary load-bearing system, you see a little asterisk next to that. And the reason that I put an asterisk next to that, and I'm going to define it, is because these are the words that are used in the legislation, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, to define what the inspections are done of. And it's the building's primary load-bearing system, which this comes directly out of the pending legislation. It's the assemblage of structural components within a building that by contiguous interconnection form a path by which external and internal forces applied to the building are delivered to the foundation. Now, to put that more in legal terms, since I think we have a number of attorneys here, and this is for legal CEUs, I think you can see my pointer on the screen. I've got a couple arrows here. There's the weight of the building at the top vertically. It's the dead live load, which is the load, the weight of the building. The live load, and these are the definitions by the code. The live load is the weight of the people, the furniture, those type of things inside of the building. And another live load they may consider snow on the roof. Like I look outside my window and it's snowing right now in New Jersey. So these are loads that are vertical loads on the building. I mean, there's other ones, but these are the primary ones. Horizontal loads are generally wind loads. For example, a wind load may be 100 miles an hour, which equates into 30 pounds per square foot. And I don't want to go into too much engineering with that, but there's horizontal loads such as the wind and the seismic, which is earthquake. So what you've got is the beams and the columns, like the beams here are shown in blue, the columns are shown in red, and the primary load bearing system is what takes these forces and delivers it to the foundation at the bottom. So I just wanted to show you that because when we get into the legislation, this is the definition of what is inspected as part of the inspections. So what is the building's facade? And there's a number of slides I've added to here because we're talking about facades also. A facade is the exterior sides of the building, the exterior walls and the things that are attached to it. Now you'll see in a minute why it's we're starting to talk about this more and more in terms of the facade, because things like balconies are parts of the facade. They're calling appurtenances, and I'll show you in a minute if you don't realize what happened in New Jersey when it came to a balcony just a few weeks ago. But what we're talking about is an evolution. We started, and I'll show you. And so there are things that are changing with this. I think we're getting pretty much to the end with what should be included and how it should be presented. But that's why I've included a facade. The purpose of the facade, other than to look good, is to prevent air or water from entering the interior spaces. So the facade keeps you dry and keeps the wind from blowing in, hopefully. There are two types of facades. There's what's called a load-bearing facade, and it's a wall system that supports not only the vertical loads that are applied to, but also its own weight. So let's say it's brick. The facade is load-bearing if it supports the weight of the brick, or maybe it's a supporting part of the roof or something also. So then it becomes a load-bearing facade. Then there's a non-load-bearing facade, which only supports its own weight. So two basic types of facades. So what is the building not designed for? It's deterioration due to aging. So as buildings get older, they deteriorate. What we're talking about in all the things we're doing is not based on a building being built wrong. It's being based on a building aging and us not taking care of them that creates problems. So what is it not designed for? A couple of things that have gotten us to where we are, which you're all aware of. The Surfside tragedy in Florida, in which the building collapsed. That's the building. I don't have to go into detail. You all know about it, I'm sure. But this has been, although a terrible, terrible tragedy, but one of the good things that comes out of tragedy sometimes, and this is one of those cases, is that there's a lot of things going on across the country to make sure this type of thing doesn't go on, doesn't happen again, such as the legislation in New Jersey. But the Surfside tragedy, and then most recently, you may have seen in the news, this is Seabright, New Jersey. This just happened last week, and this is why we're getting more and more involved in facades. Some places got involved in facades before that, but in this case, a concrete balcony, which you can see in this picture, fell. You can see it was sitting right here where the pointer is. I don't have to tell you, but this collapsed and fell, and there was actually a worker that was killed when this happened. So this just happened recently in the last week or so. So another critical thing is why facades are becoming even more of a focus than they were before. So now, as a result of the tragedy of the Champlain Towers in Surfside, CAI came out with a public policy report on condominium safety. I was one of the co-chairs in developing this. Ed was on the National Task Force to develop this public policy. And in this public policy report, which if anybody wants a copy, I can send it to you, or it's at the CAI National's website where you can download it for nothing. It deals with reserve studies and funding, critical thing, maintenance and structural integrity. Keep in mind that I've added a note at the bottom here which says not facades. They're not included in the public policy. And this was based primarily on a structural collapse of Surfside. But I can promise you on a national basis, CAI right now is investigating modifications to this public policy to start adding additional things such as the facade, And we could also touch on, and maybe Ed will mention it, that just recently there's made some suggestions to the pending legislation in New Jersey so that we do include balconies. So just a couple other things, what others do. For example, in Ontario, Canada, and Singapore, they have very specific guidelines in terms to structural integrity and safety inspections of buildings. These have been in place for a number of years. Singapore's is very, very detailed, so is Ontario's. A little note that the requirement in Ontario, Canada for doing structural inspections is based on a collapse that took place, I think it was about 20 years ago. And because of that, they have legislation for structural integrity inspections similar to the direction we're going in. Singapore has been in place for a number of years also. We also had the opportunity to look at other places around the world. And it's kind of interesting to note, which I always do, that there are other countries around the world that have structural integrity inspection requirements. But the United States, other than the 2 counties in Florida where we had the collapse, do not have any structural integrity inspection requirements. And I think we'd all agree that the one in Florida was a little inadequate based on when the first inspection was to take place. In regards to facades, there are about 13, 14, 15 cities around the country that have facade requirements where facades need to be inspected on a regular basis. These are some of the cities you'll see as part of the presentation, that in New Jersey, Cliffside Park and Jersey City have added facade inspection regulations in the last year. I would say at the most. I think Cliffside Park may have been in the last couple of months. But I always make the joke, which I guess is not really a joke, that there's facade inspection requirements across the country to make sure that people walking by buildings don't have anything fall on them to kill them. But we don't have any requirements across the country until now to do structural inspections to make sure buildings people live in don't collapse. But there are a lot of facade inspection requirements across the country. There's a number of standards. We did not reinvent the wheel. The American Society of Civil Engineers has a guideline for structural condition assessments of existing buildings, which is exactly what some of these legislative requirements are for, as well as they have another standard called guideline for condition assessment of the building envelope, which deals with facades. Now, just to tell you the difference between a facade and a building envelope. The facade is the exterior walls of the building. The building envelope includes the roof, essentially. So it's an envelope of the entire building, but the standards we're talking about are the facades. So when you go into this standard, it talks about the building sides, which are the facades, as well as the roof, and it's considered the building envelope. So that's the difference between the two. Now with this, I'm going to talk and go into some detail about the New Jersey legislative initiative. But before I do that, if he doesn't mind, I'm going to ask Ed to give us all an update on where we stand legislatively in the state of New Jersey. So Ed, you don't mind, I assume, because you're here, sure. You're trapped.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mitch. I gather you'll go through a lot of the details, so I won't. But and thanks for letting me present and welcome everybody. So New Jersey has introduced legislation through Senator Singleton's office and Assemblywoman Lopez's office. In the Senate, it's S-2760. In the Assembly, it's A-4384. We worked with the Office of Legislative Services when they typically draft legislation for legislators, and they took a great deal of our input and created the initial document, and then we've gone through a couple of revisions. We provided testimony to the Senate Urban Affairs and Community Affairs Committee that's headed by Senator Singleton in September, and I think received a pretty good reception from the senators. We did have objections, strong objections from the New Jersey Apartment Association, and somewhat lesser objections, but nonetheless, and really more valid objections from the New Jersey Builders Association. And so the update is kind of as follows. As Mitch has mentioned, we are adding and requesting that we add now balconies. The CIL collapse about 3 weeks ago really kind of highlighted that need. And when you look at that type of facility, it seems to make sense. We also, in response to the Builders Association, they had an objection that the initial inspections came too quickly, and that there might be too many inspections for many older buildings. And so we've offered a staging platform such that within 5 years of the building receiving a CO, when 6 years before the legislation, they'll have to get the building inspected. And then it's 5 to 10 years when it's 4 years before the legislation, and then within 2 years for a building that's 10 years old. So we, rather than everybody getting done in 2 years, we offered this staging. We've briefly discussed that with them, but we're going to more formally discuss it with them. We've added that in the capital reserve section that, you know, we do want the reserve schedules to include a line item for the structural inspections as a cost center. There was objections on the reserves from Assemblywoman Lopez's office with respect to the catch-up period. So we're asking for people to be funded in accordance with the reserve study. It had been, I think, 5 years. We've kind of doubled it to 10 years to give them time, and 10 years, which would include 2 5-year updates, so that by the 8th or 9th year, they ought to know where they're heading. We'll allow them to run their fund balance down to the baseline, but no lower. They can never go negative, and they shouldn't be assessing. So we think that gives associations that maybe are in some jeopardy some additional time to fund reserves. That was a strong objection from the legislators, and we think this is going to help. So the builders in general kind of didn't want the legislation at all, but they were willing to work with us on it, and it was that frequency of inspections. They didn't have a bone to pick with the reserves. New Jersey Apartment Association just wants nothing to do with it and just were critical. So where we stand, and then Mitch, I'm almost done, is we've reapproached Senator Singleton through our lobbyist, Michelle Jager of NBI. We've also reapproached the Assemblywoman Lopez and her staff. We didn't have an audience with Lopez, but with her staff, and they're beginning to buy on and understand. So she's kind of waiting to see what Senator Singleton may do with regard to adding balconies, but didn't seem to have any objection. They are agreeing with us that the reserve specialist should be as certified through CAI. That was something else that we added. We had another organization by accident. Let me see, what was the other comment? And that's about it. They want to hear from us on the Assemblywoman Lopez wants to hear from us on the reserve funding. The status is after the budget work sessions in April and I guess a break in May is when the crunch is really going to be on. We may be doing some updates. The budget gets announced, I guess, in July, and that has always been sort of our end target that we have to get the legislators and their attention. We're kind of fighting up against the governor's announcement that is annual meeting or budget meeting, I guess, that he was talking about the budget in I guess a couple of weeks ago, I'm sorry, that he wants no new taxes kind of pledge. So we have to steer clear of anything that we're doing with respect to the reserves or the inspections does not appear to be a tax. And that's going to be a political discussion. Mitch, I think that's about the update. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Ed. I assume you guys can still hear me. By the way, have you guys ever written something down and you wrote something down that you didn't mean to write? Somebody's already pointed out, and Ed said it. I put down that the balcony collapse was in Seabright. It was actually in Sea Isle. And I knew it, believe it or not, I did know that. I don't know why I wrote Seabright, so I'm going to have to correct that if I ever give this presentation again. So I noticed somebody pointed out in the chat room, and Ed said it also, trying to politely correct me. So I apologize for that. So let's get back to the presentation. So as Ed mentioned, the New Jersey legislation that's pending includes periodic inspections, reserve studies, reserve funding, and maintenance. And you'll see on the side, it says, the importance of structural integrity of residential buildings in New Jersey has become growing concern for many, especially in the wake of the tragic collapse of a high-rise multifamily housing structure in Florida. So as I mentioned before, and Ed mentioned, that's the basis for where we're going and what's going on. So the first thing is, what is a covered building? What buildings are included in this legislation? These words come directly, again, if I have a parentheses around it, that means it comes directly from the legislation. A covered building means a residential building that is categorized as use group R1 or R2, which essentially means multifamily residential, having load-bearing concrete, masonry, steel, hybrid structure, including but not limited to heavy timber and a building with podium decks. So the thing to take away from this is that the covered buildings are not based on height. It's based on the materials the building are made out of. So a number of times you read articles about what happened in Florida, and it talks about high-rise buildings, so people categorize them as high-rise, and that's the problem, but that's not the case. And if you look at all of the standards that I mentioned, they talk about deterioration of structures based on the type of material, not based on the height of the building, which we'll get into in a second when I show you some of the other legislation, some other towns. The other thing I have to mention, because I don't think I'm having a presentation, is that people feel that, or the perception is that you have more rapid deterioration of a building if it's closer to the ocean or something like that. The Florida legislation that they came out with had different requirements for periodic inspection timing based on how close the building is to the ocean. There's no question that water causes deterioration to a building. There's no question that if water has salt in it, it may make the deterioration happen more quickly. There's no question that there's salt in the water around the ocean. And there's no question that there's salt in the water of a parking garage that is not near the ocean. So there's an article that just came out that in Florida, there's a move underfoot to change the current legislation so that it doesn't differentiate timeframes based on closeness to water, because the scientific facts have proven that it's not a geographic problem. It happens everywhere where there's rain. So I just want to mention that because I don't think it's in the presentation. Planning for building safety starts when the building is being built. Proper construction and planning is important for future building safety. Now, again, most of the things I'm going into the weeds here, but I'm showing you the specific words out of the pending legislation. If the construction inspector determines that the primary load-bearing system, again, using that term that I mentioned before, is not in conformance with the building plans, what this is saying is that when they're building a building, if the primary structural system does not match exactly the design drawings, that may be okay, but before a certificate of occupancy for that building is issued, there has to be an engineer that writes a report that says that the way it was built is equivalent structurally to the way it was designed. So again, planning for building safety starts when the building is being built. So if it's built differently, doesn't mean it's built wrong, but built differently, but has the same structural capacity, there has to be a confirmation report from an engineer that says that before the CO will be issued. Next, when does the first inspection take place? After the bill is passed, it would be within the way it's written now, it would be within 15 years after the building is constructed. And I'll touch on why the reasoning for that in a minute, but it's within 15 years. And basically, you'll see in the end is that because the new legislation will include requirements for maintenance of the building, while in the past it did not. So the argument is made that if it's being maintained properly based on the certain requirements, that the first inspection doesn't need to take place as quickly, so it would be 15 years. And again, to the right are the actual words. To the left, I'm summarizing what it says. For buildings that were built prior to the bill passage, and Ed mentioned this, originally the legislation said all buildings prior to the bill passage, I think, had to be inspected within 2 years. And then after discussion, it was realized that 2 years there's so many buildings that it's not going to happen within 2 years. So let's make it a little more realistic. So right now, the pending legislation says that if a building is 10 years or older since the CO was released, the first inspection is within 2 years. If it's 5 to 10 years old, then it would be within 4 years. And if it's 0 to 5 years old, the first inspection would be 6 years. Now, you notice that these, no matter which category we're talking about, is in all cases less than the 15 years. But again, the reasoning behind that is that buildings that will be built after the passage of this will have certain requirements in terms of inspections during construction, as well as in the institution of a maintenance program for a building. So that's why it's later than 15 years. All right, the first report, and again, to the right are the actual words, will include a condition of the primary load-bearing system. We talked about that term. It will include any required maintenance or repair that is necessary based on that inspection, as well as description of the work that is needed. And we'll also include in there when the next inspection is required, but the next inspection can't be any longer than 10 years from the date of the first report or within 60 days if there's observable damage. Now, keep in mind, and I'll touch on it later on, that if you go in to do an inspection and there's something that presents an immediate structural issue, it's going to have to be taken place care of immediately. But if damage is noted, it's 60 days if observable damage is seen. Again, directly from the writer, the direct words from the legislation. Subsequent inspection reports after the first one, no later than 10 years after the prior inspection for buildings up to 20 years old. And once a building becomes 20 years old, it has to be a maximum of every 5 years. The reason why it's shorter time periods as buildings get older is because there's it's called progressive deterioration. As things get older, deterioration happens more rapidly. So that's why it's less after 20 years. The other thing to keep in mind, it's no later than. The reason it says no later than is if you go back to the prior slide, it says that if the report that is done should say when the next inspection has to be done, but these are maximum time periods. So if you may go into a building and say, based on the conditions we see here, it should be inspected in 4 years, the 10 years is the maximum, but it's governed by what it says in the inspection report. So those are subsequent inspections. Who does these inspections? It's a professional engineer. The specific wording on the right says that the structural inspector means an engineer licensed by the state who has the same qualifications required of an engineer under contract with the enforcing agency. Essentially what it's saying in engineering terms, not in legislative terms, is that structural inspections need to be done under the purview of a licensed professional engineer that has structural engineering experience. I will put a little asterisk in there. Keep in mind that there are plenty of licensed structural engineers that know how to design a new building. I'm not aware of any classes that are taught in engineering schools that talk about how do you inspect an existing building. So there's certain specialties in terms of inspecting existing buildings that just because a person is a PE doesn't necessarily mean they have the experience or qualifications to inspect an existing building. So I'm going to put a little asterisk on that. What are some of the local laws that are in place? By the way, let me stop for a second. That's the New Jersey legislation overview in terms of structural inspections. I'm going to move on to some local requirements that are already in place. But does anybody have any questions about the state legislative? I'm going to stop share for a second. Anybody have any questions about what's going on with the state legislation for Ed to answer? No? All right. Well, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box also. But that's pretty much an overview of the state legislation that's pending. All right, now there's a couple of towns that have things in place already. There's Jersey City, Cliffside Park, and Hackensack. And I'm going to go through each one of them to show you what it says, because I want to show you the differences between them and the similarities. And it's kind of interesting what some of them say. I will tell you that the Jersey City and Cliffside Park specifically require structural inspections and facade inspections. The Hackensack requirement is to inspect parking garages only, because they had a parking garage that collapsed a number of years ago. That's where that came from. But let's start with Jersey City, New Jersey. There's two certain specific requirements in place. One for structure, which is every 10 years. And let me read you what it says. It's structural inspection requirements. In order to maintain a building's structural integrity, the following requirements shall apply to all existing buildings or buildings constructed hereafter, which are concrete buildings more than 6 stories in height. Now, this has been out for a little while, and as soon as I read this, I hope nobody from Jersey City is listening on this call, but this is limiting structural inspections to only concrete buildings that are more than 6 stories in height. Now, as soon as I see that, I say, first of all, now you're basing it on height, you're not basing it on material. And what happens if you have a reinforced concrete building that's 5 stories in height and has a structural problem? Well, what happens if you have a structural steel building that's 10 stories in height that has a structural problem? But this is what Jersey City says for structural. It's very specific. Concrete more than 6 stories in height. In this case, the visual inspection will be conducted every 10 years by a licensed architect or engineer. So an architect or engineer, keep in mind, I'm a licensed structural engineer, and I'm sure there are some architects that are qualified to look at structures, but architects by nature are not trained to do structural designs, but they've included architects in there. The inspection must include, but not as limited to, see, there's a little difference here, the inspection of foundation, balconies. So they've included the balconies as part of the structure, not as part of the facade, which is good, clearly, because it's included. All structural members and waterproofing. They've included in the structural part, looking at waterproofing, which from a logical perspective, you may think that should be part of the facade, not part of the structure. But I'm glad it's in there, because if a building leaks, the thing that creates the most damage to the structure is water. So if the waterproofing isn't right and the building gets, and the structure gets wet, it's going to deteriorate faster. There's no question about it. The inspection shall be in addition to other building inspections. The initial inspection shall be completed by December 31st, 2022, which we passed, obviously. Thereafter, a structural inspection must be conducted every 10 years. Now, it doesn't say maximum of 10 years. It just says every 10 years. So it's not relying on the results of the prior reports. So this is what it says in Jersey City for the structure. Jersey City statute or ordinance also refers to a checklist. Now, this is what the checklist looks like for the structure. It says, when you read it, it talks about this, you have to have a description of the structure, nature of environmental and loading conditions. Is there draining? Do the flashing joints, weep holes, and everything work as part of the structural inspection? What are the loading conditions? Is it dead load, live load, all kinds of things? So they've developed a punch list, which is 3 pages. It gets into distress indicators. It gets into soils, foundation conditions, overall apparent alignment of structures. So they have a very specific checklist that you're supposed to use as a minimum for doing an inspection for the structure in Jersey City. Now, keep in mind, it has things like staining, efflorescence, exposed reinforcement, and corrosion. So there's a lot of things in here that specifically pertain to the structure. And there's a number of things that go over and above what the structure of the building is. Although if they're not done right, they may cause consequential damage to the structure, such as waterproofing. Now, this is the 3rd page. It says surface, coatings, types and thickness, all kinds of things, penetrating sealer. Now, keep in mind, this is the structure. Now, let's go on to Jersey City for the facade. And what it says is, in order to maintain a building's facade in safe condition, the following requirements shall apply to all existing buildings which are more than 6 stories in height or consist of a masonry facade and are 4 stories or more in height. Now, the difference is, they're absolutely right. When you do an inspection of facade, generally the facade requirements are based on the height of the building, not based on the material of construction. So, but they're basing it on 6 stories in height, or if it's masonry, 4 stories in height. The facade inspection, which is not unusual if you look across the country, it's much more frequent than the structural inspection, conducted every 5 years, again by a licensed architect engineer, and it must include an inspection of all exterior wall and appurtenances. That's a word that a lot of people use, which is anything attached to it. And in many cases, the appurtenance term deals with a balcony on a facade. But in Jersey City, they've included the balconies as part of the structure. But keep in mind also that they don't use the term primary load-bearing system. They just say structure. So a balcony is a structure, but it only supports itself. And that's the difference between a primary load-bearing system, because if the balcony collapses, the building isn't going to fall, but it is a structural element. This inspection will include any other inspections, and also the initial inspection by December 31st, 2023, thereafter every 5 years. Just like with the structure, Jersey City has a checklist. And here's the checklist: facade description, general conditions. There's actually some overlap between some of the things in the facade inspection requirements and the structural inspection requirements. I haven't gone through and checked, right next to each other, the things that are on the checklist, but you can see here that they leaks, so water infiltration, major damage, but there is a checklist. Coatings, it talks about coatings in the structural section also, but this is the checklist that they provide. And if I'm not mistaken, it does say in the wording that these are the minimum things you should look for. But this is a list: efflorescence, it's a material specific condition. So Jersey City is very specific. They have another checklist dealing with the facade. They also include windows and doors and all kinds of things. So that's Jersey City. Now let's move on to Cliffside Park. Cliffside Park is relatively recent. I know there's a number of buildings that were involved in that all of a sudden they need inspections up in Cliffside Park in the buildings, but so it's relatively recent. And here's what Cliffside Park says. It's every 10 years, structural inspection requirement. In order to maintain a building's structural integrity, the following requirements shall apply to all existing buildings or buildings constructed of steel, stick, brick, stucco, fabricated panel facades, concrete. So even under structural, they're mixing up the words because they have a separate wording in regards to facades, but they include panel facades as part of the structure. And or concrete buildings more than 4 stories in height, consisting of in excess of 12 residential units. So it's kind of interesting. They say apply to all existing building construction, steel, all these things. But if it's concrete, it has to be 4 stories more in height and 12 residential units. So there's a mixing up of terminology in what they do. But you can see that it's different than what it says in Jersey City, because Jersey City says structural concrete only above 6 stories. The visual inspection shall include photographs and all kinds of things submitted to the borough every 10 years by licensed engineer. It goes on, it should be limited to inspection of foundations, blah, 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 this kind of stuff. Now, it does say in the Cliffside Park that they have a checklist. Just so you know, they have not issued the checklist yet, but they have issued the ordinance. So the checklist is on the way, because we've spoken to the town in the last few days and the checklist has not been issued yet. So now let's talk about the facade in Cliffside Park. Here now it says, which are more than 3 stories in height, consist of masonry, structural steel, stucco or planking, and or brick attached dwellings in excess of 20 feet. So they're saying more than 3 stories or in excess of 20 feet. But you can see that the wording on these things, first of all, Jersey City and Cliffside Park don't match in terms of the wording and things like that. But sometimes the wording is confusing even to read. So again, this is what Cliffside Park says. Again, it refers to a punch list or checklist like they have in Jersey City, but they have not issued that checklist yet. And somewhere in here it says when the first one have to be done by, but I left it out, but I think it's within the next year. Now let's go on to Hackensack. Hackensack requires parking garages to be inspected every 5 years. We're in the process of putting together parking garage inspection reports on probably 4 or 5 parking garages right now. And not to throw it out as a danger zone, but parking garages are subjected to all kinds of environmental conditions. And not only that, with the cars driving in and out in the winter, they carry this road salting, which there's no question about it, creates deterioration pretty quickly because of all the salts in the water. Not by the ocean, but by the conditions it's exposed to, because they're exposed to the elements. But here it says, owners of commercial or multifamily residential dwelling units with a parking structure, including open or enclosed, detached or attached, below grade or above or below the street level, shall be required to submit signed and sealed evaluation reports stating the integrity and condition of their parking structure every 5 years. It shall include a completion schedule for any and all mandatory repairs and maintenance. And then it says that if you need a building permit to do the work, you have to get it. So, but it also says shall not apply to detached wood frame garages, which generally are one-story garages. So in Hackensack, it's very specific in terms of parking garages. Now this says every 5 years. In the reports we've done, even though it says every 5 years, based on the condition we have seen, we have made recommendations in most cases that the next inspection be done in less than 5 years based on conditions and the rate of deterioration. But this is what Hackensack has for parking garages. Does anybody have any questions about any of the various towns or and what they have as far as their ordinances, or because now I'm moving on for a couple minutes to the reserve requirements. No? Okay. So
yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. When I'm in this one, I'm not. All right, go ahead.
Hi, Mitch. It's Stephanie. It's Stephanie Harmon. How are you this morning?
Good, thanks.
Where does this all apply, or does it not apply to clubhouses? Because Ed just answered a chat that it doesn't apply to clubhouses, and I had thought during the October CAI it was going to incorporate clubhouses, especially multi-level clubhouses, or what their structure is. I mean, we have clubhouses that have events, especially in 55 and over, that are 200 plus. So is there no standards now for clubhouses going to be incorporated in this legislation?
I'm not, and I'm going to let Ed jump in to correct me, but I'm not really aware of a separate clubhouse being included unless it's part of a residential building that people actually essentially sleep in. I mean, Ed, am I getting that right as far as?
Yeah, I think so. And Stephanie, I just responded a little further.
Okay, great.
I think, part of the dilemma is, the catastrophe and that type of building. The second is clubhouses typically in active adult communities are stick frame. And if we start introducing stick frame construction, albeit there are maybe, certain structural members to support those, expansive ballrooms, we're just opening a can of worms for other types of buildings and likely more objections. My reply to you is we can't always legislate everything that a board should do, but boards are fiduciaries. And in light of events that are occurring with structural, failures on balconies and or buildings, I suggest that, boards should look at their structural, look at the structure of their buildings and hire engineers to take a look to make sure they're in good shape and follow the guidelines.
Okay, so then even the reserve funding in which you were speaking about earlier doesn't apply.
No, it does. No, the reserve funding is a modification to the Planned Real Estate Full Disclosure Act, and that would absolutely apply.
All right, I believe that's where I got a little confused. Thank you, gentlemen.
Sure.
You're welcome. And keep in mind, not to go off on another tangent, but as you know, Fannie and Freddie have modified their lending regulations that require safety inspections. If I'm not mistaken, those safety inspections in a condo community would include all buildings, not just ones people live in. But if you tune in tomorrow, there's some more information on the Fannie and Freddie stuff because we've been pretty involved in that stuff. So let me go back to the share screen. And all right, so now I'm going to talk a little about what does the legislation have in it in regards to reserve requirements. And it says that every association that's covered needs to have let me back up a second. Right now in the state of New Jersey, as Ed just mentioned, when a developer creates a community association, as part of the governing documents budgets, by requirement, they need to include a reserve study. That reserve study, up until about 5 years ago in the DCA regulations, said that it has to be an adequate reserve funding in the governing documents. There was a huge amount of confusion about what adequate means, on and on, so you're probably all aware of that. I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago already, CAI, the New Jersey builders, the DCA all got together, and those current regulations have been modified that it still requires a reserve study be done and funded, but now there's a definition of adequate in there. So what I'm going to touch on, one of the slides here is an addition in the legislation, an addition what's currently required over and above a reserve study. But now let's go back to an association that exists. And what it says is that they must have a reserve study. If they have one that's not done within 5 years, that it needs to be done or updated within 1 year, and that they need to have a new reserve study done every 5 years. Now, the reserve requirements include having a 30-year funding plan. The board can pick the funding plan, but it not only says that a reserve study is required to be done, but it also says that it has to be funded, included in conformance with that reserve study. So it's kind of interesting that across this country, there's a number of states that have legislation in place in regards to reserves. Some states say they have to have a reserve study, but it doesn't say a word about funding. Other states say they have to fund a reserve, but they don't say anything about a reserve study. A lot of times it doesn't overlap. So that's why both in CAI's national public policy as well as the legislation, it's very clear that not only do you have to do a reserve study, but you have to fund it. So the association must fund in conformance with the study. Now, it goes on, as Ed mentioned, First, let me talk about what in the legislation uses the word adequate in a few different places. What adequate means essentially by definition is that in the funding plan, if the association needs to get money from borrowing or from a special assessment or any other place other than the reserve study, then it's not adequately funded. That's essentially the definition. For those of you who know the National Reserve Study Standards, it's essentially saying that baseline funding is adequate funding, which when you'll never run into a deficit. But now I think I have these slides in here twice, but now it talks about that if you're not adequately funded, that affects your overall operating budget, where it goes up more than 10%, then you have 10 years to get back to adequate funding. If it affects the operating budget, but it doesn't go over 10%, then you have 2 years to catch up to get to adequate funding. And I think I for some reason, I left these slides in at 6 o'clock in the morning when I was finishing this presentation, because I actually have the specific wording from the legislation further on in this presentation. But as far as the concept, I got it right, I'm pretty sure. Now let's talk about the structural evaluation. What's included? There's some standards and includes things. I'm just going to give some examples from existing reports. It has a table of contents with attachments. It has a description of the structure. For example, in this case, it's from the buildings made out of reinforced concrete. So it explains what it is, how it works. It has a description of the structure. This is in this case, this is a description of the structure from a report where it's showing the beams and the columns. Then up above, it's actually showing how it was supposed to be built based on the structural design drawings. It has a description of the facade. In this case, it's showing they have concrete balconies, concrete eyebrows, which are the concrete that supports the walls and the balconies around the perimeter. So there's a description of the facade. Up until a couple of weeks ago, this presentation really just talked about the description of the structure, but because of what's going on with the facades, I've added some additional slides. It has the investigation methodology. For example, this is a parking garage and a structure where the red line says how we walked through the methodology. And then as we were walking through, we were taking pictures of conditions and identifying exactly where they were. This is a facade methodology where we started up here on the top of the building and we used a drone and we flew back and forth to document the facade. Then here's some of the findings. Then we get into the structure. For example, we identify the location, in this case in the parking garage, and the condition. Then here's another example of finding of the structures. The reason I wanted to show this slide is because this is a plan of a building. This little red box shows the location of a column. Now to the right, we took pictures of all 4 sides of the column. The reason we did that is because deterioration is progressive. And you'll see when I get up to some slides in a little while that we took pictures of all 4 sides because we want to, in our next report, be able to go back and look at the prior report to see if there's any progressive deterioration of the structure, even if there isn't that one now. So let's say you look at one of these columns, it looks great, but now you go back and look at it in 3 or 4 years or whatever the time frame is, and you see cracking and you see problems, you'll know how rapidly the condition is progressing. So this type of evaluation, which is sometimes called a baseline inspection, is an inspection where you can measure for certain future inspections against for a condition. Here's findings of facade. Now here you got locations on the facade where there's problems. Here's where it shows exactly on the plan where it is. And then we include a condition and what the condition is that we saw. Now here's another one of facade, similar type of thing. Now, very, very important, and it's interesting because, well, it's interesting to me at least. One of the things that's very important to keep in these reports is a condition description. What does it mean? So for example, if I put in a report that a condition is severe or moderate or minor, what does it mean? So you need a description of what it means. I know that I'm involved in right now, they're drafting legislation similar to this in Delaware. And believe it or not, I'm on that task force that are doing that. One of the things we're going to be including is what definitions all the engineers have to use when doing their reports so it's consistent. In Philadelphia, they have facade inspection requirements. Inside their facade inspection requirements, very specific what rating system you have to use when you're doing your reports. But condition descriptions are very important. I know that I've seen a couple of inspection reports done by others where they talk about conditions, but they don't really rate them against each other, such as this, with a description of severe, moderate, and minor. And of course, there's different types of words, but the description may be the same. For example, severe, take care of it right away. Moderate, requires, we said requires a secondary periodic inspection within 12 months. So here, in terms of minor, we say within 3 years. So you need a rating system. So here, findings, this is some examples. Conditions we saw, where in this case was minor. And here you see a little picture of some minor cracking. So that's an example of what it looks like in the report. Here's something that's moderate. We see scaling and you see exposed reinforcing steel. Here's the exact location, and this is considered monitor. You need to monitor and take a look at it again in a year from now. And in this case, I don't have to tell you, but this is a severe condition that needs to be taken care of right away. And here's some close-up pictures of a severe condition where it's not good. So in this case, what they did, because it was immediate, is they put together a plan instantly to put in temporary shoring because there was a structural concern. And then after that, a design was done to fix it right away. So you have to rate it. Now, here's some of the other pillars to connect. Like I said, I left those slides in by mistake, but this is going to a little more detail of the specific wording in the legislation in regards to reserves. It says any association shall undertake and fund a capital reserve study to assess the adequacy of the association's capital reserves to meet the anticipated cost of replacement repair of the capital assets. It goes on to say a capital reserve study conducted pursuant to this section shall be prepared based on the National Reserve Studies standards of CAI, and it should be performed or overseen by a reserve specialist who's credentialed through the Community Associations Institute, which Ed mentioned before, or an engineer or architect who is licensed by the state, and then the report should include the following. This is specifically right in there. Then, by the way, the National Reserve Study Standards, Ed and I are on a national task force, are being revised right now. They're 99% done. And as part of tomorrow's presentation, if you really are interested, I'm going to go into detail what those changes are and what those changes are, because you should be interested. If you're a manager involved with reserves, it's going to make some changes. As mentioned before, associations who have not undertaken a reserve study within 5 years of the effective date of this legislation shall undertake a reserve study within 1 year. And let's see, shall undertake 1 year of the effective date of legislation. And if it's a new association and they have a new board of trustees, shall undertake a reserve study as soon as practical after the election of the majority of an executive board, but at no event shall be more than 2 years following the election of the majority of the executive board. That's for new communities that are going through turnover, transition, all that kind of stuff. Now we talk about if the association does not have adequate reserve fund as described in the way I defined it for you a few minutes ago, then if it's more than 10% increase in the previous year's common expenses, then you have one of two choices to get to adequate: 10 years or the period of time until the next replacement has to be done that will put you in a deficit. So if you have something that, according to the reserve study, needs to be replaced within 3 years, but you don't have the money to do it, the reserve fund has to be brought back up to adequacy by the time that component needs to be replaced. Very logical. If you don't do it, increase it, you're going to have a special assessment or borrowing or something anyway. So you need to bring it back up to adequacy within that period of time or within 10 years. And if it's less than 10% increase in the annual budget, then I think it's 2 years. Let's see the next slide. Then it is 2 fiscal years. So if it's less than 10% impact, then you have 2 years to bring it back to adequacy. Now, the initial budget. Now, I mentioned before that the developer, when they create a community, has to include adequate reserves in their budget. The new requirement for developers, and this is why the first inspection, structural inspection, for something after this legislation is passed will be 15 years, but for buildings before it, you saw the time frame, 2 years, 3 years, up to 6 years. But the developer shall prepare a document, including the governing documents, which sets forth a preventive maintenance task be undertaken by the association over the life of the common area components. The preventive maintenance document shall provide the maintenance schedule and timing for preventive maintenance including but not limited to periodic inspections of the structural components or common area of the association. So one of the things that the initial budget is going to tie into the type of covered buildings I talked about is that the original budget is going to include in it the cost of doing the structural inspections when they're needed. And the developer should include it in the budget, let's see, all operating expenses associated with preventive maintenance set forth in that document. So, and then it says the preventive maintenance document shall be updated at the completion of any structural inspections that are performed. So one of the things that you're going to see that if you do a periodic inspection and it says something needs to be fixed within 3 years, the person who's doing the reserve study should be reviewing that report and putting into the reserve schedule the cost of doing that repair. It's a slight difference from the concept of doing reserve schedules prior to this, because prior to this, most reserve studies were based on cyclical replacement. You have to replace the roof every 20 years, every 20 years, every 20 years. But here you may be doing repairs to the structural that's a one-time repair, and it should be put into the reserve study. So these are some of the things, the initial budget, in addition to adequate reserves, that should be included. Ed, did I miss anything?
No, you got it.
Okay, thanks. All right. So any questions on the reserve for the associations or the reserve for the developer? I can't see if your hands go up. So if there are any, let me know because I can't see you guys. All right. So now let's talk. I just want to give a couple of different definitions here so you can have them in the background and understand. Maintenance is the process of preserving something. Now, the reason I wanted to put this in here is because a lot of people consider all maintenance to be the same. And I just want to tell you there's essentially 3 different types of maintenance. The first is, I'm going to go to the bottom and start with deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means you're not doing anything. You're deferring maintenance and you're not doing it. One of the things that's interesting in our industry, including me, is that sometimes we confuse the term deferred maintenance with preventive maintenance. If you're doing deferred maintenance, it's wrong. Preventive maintenance is the term we use, which is a proactive maintenance plans to do things so some things will exceed or meet their estimated useful life and keep them in good condition. Preventive maintenance. Simply, if you have a reserve component with a 20-year life, you want to do preventive maintenance so it gets 20 years or more. Corrective maintenance is maintenance that's done when you look at something and there's a problem that you didn't anticipate and you have to fix it. That's called corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance is what I mentioned before, that in your reserve study, if the report says corrective maintenance or repair or fixing of something needs to be done, the cost and timing of that corrective maintenance should be added to the reserve study. Now, I put in this slide because I want to show you there's a direct connection between the structure, reserves, and maintenance. Here you're looking at a building with a parking garage below, the podium deck, which is the term that's used. Now, the podium deck has a membrane and decking, which is probably included in the reserve study. The structure below it is protected by the podium deck because water doesn't get through. The podium membrane and decking are included in the preventive maintenance program. So if you don't have a preventive maintenance program, the water is going to leak through and rust out and deteriorate the structure. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. This thing's jumping around. So if you don't have preventive maintenance, it will leak and destroy the structure underneath. If that happens, then on your reserve study, instead of having a 15-year life, let's say for the membrane on the podium deck, you may only have 5 years left, not 15 years. And in both cases, the structure is protected by the podium deck above. Now, this is just one example, but I wanted to show this so people understand that there's a connection between reserve, structure, and maintenance. And this is how the connection can be seen pretty clearly. And I'm sure a number of you have buildings that have podium decks. The other thing that there's a misconception is everybody thinks that it's going to cost more to do what we're talking about. If you look at the life cycle of a building and you take the approximate cost of preventive maintenance, there's a few different standards that give you different answers, but I use the guideline that preventive maintenance will cost you about 5% of the replacement cost spread over the life of the component. But if you don't do preventive maintenance and you have to do corrective maintenance, then it's going to cost you significantly more. It could cost you 30 times more than the total cost of preventive maintenance to fix things. So when people say to you, by doing what we're talking about, it's going to cost them more money, it's not true. It's going to cost them less money. The other thing I want to mention is there's concern that these reserve requirements are going to make people pay more money and their fees are going to go up. there's a yes and no answer. Now, if you have a developer that sets up a governing documents, includes adequate reserves, and you fund the adequate reserves the way it says it in the governing documents, and you update the reserve study on a regular basis, you shouldn't ever have to have a special assessment because you're updating and funding your reserves. What happens is that communities after transition take over and they decide for whatever reason, they're not going to update the reserve study, they're not going to fund the reserves, all these kind of things. Those are the associations that may run into trouble playing catch up to get to adequate reserves. But the bottom line is that if associations fund the way the original governing documents say, there's much less chance of this happening. And once an association gets back to adequate and starts amortizing replacement costs over full useful life and all those kind of things, it's actually going to cost less than if you don't do these kind of things. So keep in mind that when people get nervous about this because of Monday, it's really not true. Now, I just have a couple seconds. Tune in tomorrow for more information. There's a number of things going on with Fannie Mae and Freddie in regards to funding for refinances and buying new homes. And they're tying in their mortgages these days into the safety of their community or the structure of their community. So there's new regulations out there, mortgage lending changes. They have definitions of things like significant deferred maintenance. And I'm going to touch on these a little more tomorrow in terms of the banking requirements. You're probably all familiar with this new form that they've come out with, Fannie Mae 1076, Freddie Mac 476A. We'll touch on that tomorrow. Just so you know, there's some changes going on at Fannie and Freddie just a few weeks ago. As a matter of fact, they emailed me with a couple of questions the other day. I had the opportunity to meet with them and talking about how different ways to update the standards so they work. So there's some things going on in the background. But manager's owner's role, if you see something, say something. For example, just a couple of pictures that show you what are not uncommon. Here's these silver things are gutters and downspouts that have been put in their parking garage because people didn't want water to fall onto their cars. So who knows what's going on under the gutter. If you see things like this, this brown is meaning there's rusting reinforcing steel. The white means there's water coming through. So this is step one, white, this is step two. If you have a manager and walking through your buildings, my wife will think you're crazy because I just did a video on a facade of a building in Massachusetts this past weekend. It was my Kipcon minute if you want to see it, because I see these things. And it's very easy to spot problems. Again, if you see something, do something. If you see rusting, it comes through the concrete, then there's a problem. Is this the same picture with the gutters and downspouts? If you start putting these things in, it's a problem. These netting was put in so that the ceiling of this parking garage didn't collapse. You can see the reinforcing steel, but fix it, don't cover it. And this is a parking garage we were working on where we walked in and there was a blue tarp to keep the water from dripping on the cars. As soon as we took the blue tarp away, we saw problems with the structure. Here's some other tarps that are in garages. This is a parking garage in Philadelphia where every joint is wide open. You don't see any problems. But at this one, why did they put in a gutter and downspouts? You think there's water coming through? That's creating problems. Absolutely. This is something where this is one of my favorite pictures. The association or somebody put in this to keep the water from getting on the cars. They put in this diverter, I'll call it, which now directs all the water to the steel beam that holds up the garage that's rusting away. And then if you're looking to prepare an RFP for having a structural inspection done, it should include type and age of building. Have you had any inspections performed before? That you require a site visit. So these are, we're going to send everybody a copy of this presentation, but it has some things you should look at when you're soliciting proposals to do these type of inspections, what the report requirements are. And I know that I am 3 minutes late in finishing. So I'm now just going to open it up to any questions, or feel free to send us emails. If anybody needs continuing education, either legal continuing education or manager continuing education, this has CEU credits for both. So please feel free to email me, Jody, or Chelsea, who's somewhere on this from my office, and we'd be happy to send you the certificate. So does anybody have any questions about anything?
Yeah, Mitch,
yes.
There's a question about a single family home in regards to interior damage that's occurring. They wanted to know how is it determinable to have the damage attributable to facade integrity or versus to the foundation sinking issue?
Somebody has to look at it. I mean, if you want to send us pictures, we'll take a quick look, but some of these things you really have to, words really don't explain it. And you really can't make a determination by words. Somebody really needs to have a look at it. So I hate to defer the answer, but so if you want to send us some pictures, we'd be happy to take a quick look. Anything else? All right, well, thank you everybody for attending. If you want to join us again tomorrow, you can still sign up at our website. Tomorrow we have a huge audience signed up, so it must be an interesting topic. I think we have like 120 people signed up for tomorrow's webinar. So, you know, we'd love to have you join us again. So thank you very much. Ed, thanks for joining us and giving everybody's input on what's going on legislatively. And everybody have a great day. I'm looking out the window. It's still snowing where I am. So have a good day, and maybe we'll see you tomorrow. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, great job, Mitch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Oh, Chris, how do you get the thumb to do that? I see the thumb going up and down. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. It's been a pleasure.